Chicago never really sleeps, but on the night of October 17, 2019, the streets felt eerily still. The rain had been falling in slow, deliberate sheets, turning the city into a canvas of reflections, red and green lights shimmering on the wet pavement. Somewhere in the middle of that restless city, a man was running out of time. His name was Jamal Abdi, a 27-year-old immigrant from Kenya, and in just a few minutes, he would be dead. Jamal had come to Chicago, Illinois, chasing the American dream. By day, he was a student at the University of Illinois at Chicago, UIC, determined to earn his engineering degree. By night, he worked as a taxi driver, ferrying strangers across the city, scraping together enough money to pay tuition and send what little he could back home to his family in Nairobi. That night, he was exhausted. He had taken on extra shifts, desperate to cover the rising costs of his final year. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he accepted what would be his last ride. The pickup location? A bar in Chicago's Gold Coast district, an expensive area where the elite of the city partied without a care in the world. At 11:42 p.m., 4 passengers climbed into Jamal's cab. Lucas Caldwell, Ethan Caldwell, Ava Sinclair, Brandon Marks. For names that, in a perfect world, would have meant nothing. But in this world, they belonged to privilege. More specifically, to Senator Richard Caldwell's family, the man who practically owned half the city. Jamal didn't know that yet. But by the time he realized who he was dealing with, it was already too late. From the moment the group got in, Jamal could tell something was off. They were drunk, loud, arrogant, entitled. The kind of people who saw taxi drivers as disposable, as if they existed solely for their convenience. Lucas Caldwell, the eldest at 22, slid into the front passenger seat, reeking of alcohol and entitlement. His younger brother, Ethan, 19, slumped against the back door, barely conscious. Their cousin Ava, 20, and their friend Brandon, 21, laughed carelessly, already forgetting whatever argument they'd been having before they got into the car. Jamal kept his eyes on the road, hoping for an easy ride. But that hope shattered 3 minutes in. Lucas leaned forward, tapping the dashboard. "Run that light." Jamal glanced at the traffic signal ahead, still red. He shook his head. "Sorry, sir, I can't do that." Lucas scoffed. "Come on, man. No cops around. Just go. It's the law." Lucas' face twisted with entitlement-fueled rage. "The law? Do you even know who my father is?" That's when it clicked. The Caldwells. Jamal didn't respond. He had met passengers like this before, rich kids who thought rules didn't apply to them. Usually, they were harmless. But tonight, something felt different. Ava laughed from the back seat. "God, you're so uptight. Just take us home, man." But Lucas wasn't done. He was angry now. The kind of anger that comes when someone who's had everything handed to them meets a person who won't play along. As the ride continued, the air inside the taxi grew tense. Brandon and Ava whispered to each other in hushed tones. Lucas kept glaring at Jamal, tapping his fingers impatiently against the window. Then, somewhere near Lower Wacker Drive, things turned violent. Jamal never saw the first blow coming. A sharp, sudden pain exploded in his side. A knife, tearing through fabric, through skin. His hands jerked on the wheel, the taxi swerving dangerously before coming to a shaky stop. He gasped, trying to turn around, but then came the second stab. Then the third. Blood spilled onto the driver's seat, warm and sticky. Panic set in, but Jamal was too weak to fight back. His vision blurred, his breaths coming in shallow, agonized gasps. The last thing he saw was Lucas' face, calm, cold, watching. And then, the door swung open. Boots splashed against the wet pavement. The 4 of them, Lucas, Ethan, Ava, Brandon, vanished into the night, leaving Jamal to die alone in his own taxi. At 12:07 a.m., a 911 call was made. A pedestrian, walking home from work, had noticed an abandoned cab. Its lights still on, the driver slumped over the wheel. By the time paramedics arrived, Jamal was gone. A life ended for nothing. Detectives Michael Carter and Lisa Rodriguez were the first to arrive on the scene. At first, they assumed it was a robbery gone wrong. But something didn't fit. Jamal's wallet was still in his pocket. His phone was untouched. The cash in his glove compartment was still there. This wasn't a robbery. It was something else entirely. The investigation should have been straightforward. Security cameras in the Gold Coast district caught Jamal picking up his passengers. Witnesses at the bar remembered seeing Lucas Caldwell and his group leave just before midnight. Everything pointed in one direction. But within 24 hours, the case began to fall apart. First, the security footage vanished, deleted from the city's records. Then, an eyewitness recanted their statement, suddenly unsure if they had really seen the Caldwell boys that night. And just like that, the investigation stalled. When detectives showed up at the Caldwell estate in Lake Forest, they were met with a team of high-powered attorneys. Lucas, Ethan, Ava, and Brandon refused to answer any questions. And Senator Richard Caldwell? He stood in front of the press, shaking his head in mock sympathy. This is a tragedy, a terrible, senseless loss. But I trust the justice system to handle this appropriately. It was a message, and everyone understood it. Justice was never coming. For weeks, Jamal's family begged for answers. His wife, Jamal Abdi, gave tearful interviews. His professors at UI demanded justice. His mother in Nairobi wept, wondering how the country her son had trusted had turned on him so cruelly. And then, just when it seemed like the case would be buried, an anonymous source came forward. A detective received a manila envelope. Inside, a USB drive. A recording from inside the taxi that night. The sound of Lucas' voice. "You think you can tell me what to do? Do you even know who my father is?" Then, a struggle. Then, a scream. And then, the final chilling words. "We can't leave him alive." Detectives finally had proof. But before they could act, something happened that no one saw coming. One of the suspects turned up dead. And the cover-up was about to spiral completely out of control. Chicago was still. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of a crime that should have been solved but was instead sinking into the city's underbelly, buried under power, corruption, and silence. For weeks, Jamal Abdi's murder had been stalled. Every lead was stonewalled. Every attempt at justice was suffocated. The powerful Caldwell family had ensured that their secrets stayed hidden. But secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of clawing back to the surface. When an anonymous source delivered a recording, evidence that placed Lucas Caldwell, Ethan Caldwell, Ava Sinclair, and Brandon Marks inside Jamal's taxi the night he was murdered, detectives Michael Carter and Lisa Rodriguez thought they finally had the break they needed. But before they could act, something shocking happened. One of the suspects turned up dead. And with that, the case took a terrifying new turn. The news broke early on a cold November morning. Brandon Marks was found dead. His body was discovered in a luxury penthouse in downtown Chicago, the scene gruesome. The coroner's report would later confirm it. Multiple stab wounds, eerily similar to Jamal Abdi's murder. Coincidence? No. This was a message. Detective Carter knew it the second he stepped onto the crime scene. The apartment was too clean, too perfect. Whoever had done this hadn't been sloppy. There were no signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds. Brandon Marks had let his killer in. Detective Rodriguez's voice was tight. This isn't revenge. This is control. Somebody is tying up loose ends. And just like that, the case shifted. This wasn't just one murder anymore. This was a conspiracy. The Caldwell family wasted no time in controlling the narrative. The morning after Brandon's body was found, Senator Richard Caldwell held a press conference. The cameras captured his perfectly rehearsed grief, a furrowed brow, a solemn pause, an empty sigh. "Our family is devastated by this unimaginable loss. Brandon was like a son to me. We will not rest until we find whoever did this." It was a clever move, positioning themselves as victims, not suspects. But behind the scenes, something darker was happening. Detectives Carter and Rodriguez requested a formal interview with Lucas, Ethan, and Ava. The Caldwell attorneys responded swiftly. "My clients have nothing to say." While the Caldwell family was shutting down, the detectives were digging deeper. They went back to the recording, the piece of evidence that had nearly cracked the case before Brandon's murder had shifted the focus. Lucas Caldwell's voice echoed in the evidence room. "You think you can tell me what to do? Do you even know who my father is?" Then, a struggle. Then, a scream. Then, the final chilling words. "We can't leave him alive." The voice belonged to Lucas. But something wasn't right. Rodriguez played the clip again. And again. Until, there it was. A second voice. Whispered. Almost too soft to hear. "We'll make it look clean." Rodriguez's blood ran cold. This wasn't drunken violence anymore. This was premeditated murder. And there was one suspect they had overlooked. For weeks, everyone had been focused on Lucas, Ethan, and Brandon. But there was one person who had remained eerily quiet. Ava Sinclair. The cousin. The one who had been in the back seat. The one whose voice was missing from every statement, every interrogation attempt. She had been invisible in this entire case. And now, Carter and Rodriguez knew why. She wasn't just a witness. She was the orchestrator. Detective Carter pulled up Ava's records. What they found was shocking. Unlike her reckless, arrogant cousins, Ava had been careful. Her social media was scrubbed clean. Her past flawless. But there were two things that stood out. Ava Sinclair was majoring in political science. She was the only one who hadn't lawyered up. Rodriguez leaned back in her chair. "She's the one to break." And they were right. When detectives finally brought Ava Sinclair in for questioning, she sat across from them. Calm, collected, unfazed. But Carter and Rodriguez knew how to push. They started with Jamal's murder. Then, they moved to Brandon's. And that's when they saw it. The first crack. Ava's hands tightened into fists. Rodriguez leaned in. "You were there when Jamal was killed. And now Brandon is dead. The difference. Jamal wasn't one of you. Brandon was." Silence. Then, a whisper. "I didn't kill Brandon." Rodriguez's heart pounded. "But you know who did." Ava exhaled shakily. For the first time, she looked scared. "You don't understand. I was trying to protect them. But he." She stopped. Carter's voice was sharp. "Who, Ava?" And then, she finally said it. "My uncle." The room went ice cold. Senator Richard Caldwell. Not just a corrupt politician. Not just a father covering for his sons. A man willing to kill to keep his empire intact. Everything they thought they knew about the case had just shifted. Lucas was violent. Ethan was reckless. Ava was complicit. But Senator Richard Caldwell? He was the mastermind. He had orchestrated everything, from deleting evidence, to silencing witnesses, to ensuring his son walked free. And now, he had ordered the murder of Brandon Marks, one of their own, just to keep him from talking. Ava had given them a name, but she had also made herself a target. The moment she left that police station, she was in danger, and detectives Carter and Rodriguez knew it. But before they could act, before they could get to Ava, she disappeared. Gone. And in her place, a single message. "You should have stayed out of this." The case wasn't just dangerous anymore. Now, it was personal. Some stories end with justice. Some end with closure. And then, there are the stories that never truly end. This is the story of Jamal Abdi. A man who came to America with nothing but a dream. A man who worked day and night to build a future, not just for himself, but for his family. A man who was murdered for no reason other than being in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong people. And the people who took his life. They were never meant to be caught. Because they were protected by power, by wealth, by a system built to shield the privileged and silence the forgotten. But what they didn't realize was that Jamal Abdi would not be forgotten. For months, the case dragged on. It should have been simple. An open and shut murder. There was video evidence, witnesses, a confession waiting to spill. But every time the truth got too close, it slipped away. Until one day, it didn't. An unexpected piece of evidence surfaced, the taxi's black box recording. The truth, buried deep within the car where Jamal took his last breath. And when the world finally heard it, everything changed. Lucas Caldwell, Ethan Caldwell, Brandon Marks, Ava Sinclair, and behind them all, Senator Richard Caldwell. The truth was finally out. And for a moment, just a moment, it seemed like justice had arrived. The trial was one of the most watched in the nation's history. The recordings were played in court. The brutality of that night laid bare for the world to see. Lucas and Ethan Caldwell were sentenced to life in prison. Ava Sinclair, the one person who had wanted to do the right thing, was already gone. Brandon Marks' murder was pinned on an unknown assailant, a convenient lie told to keep the Caldwell name clean. And Richard Caldwell, the man who orchestrated it all, he was convicted. But then, deals were made. Sentences were reduced. In the end, he got 10 years. 10 years for destroying a man's life. 10 years for silencing his own niece. 10 years for murder. And when those 10 years are up, he'll walk free. Because in America, men like Richard Caldwell always do. Jamal Abdi, 1989 to 2024. A father, a husband, a dreamer, gone too soon. The world have since moved on. The news cycles have found their next story. But justice? Justice came too late. And in the end, it wasn't enough. That was case of Jamal Abdi. If you find this story chilling, click the subscribe button and turn on post notification so you don't miss out on our next story. Bye for now.